This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs.
We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
There are many fundamental problems in the study of human evolution, an immense array of really intriguing questions, in part because the evolutionary journey has involved an astonishing transformation. One way of looking at this transformation is through a pairing of slides. I thought I'd start with the raciest one first, but also the most endangering in some ways. But it poses, this pairing of slides that I'm going to show you poses a question. And it's, how is it that our ancestry included, in an imaginative way in this reconstruction, dilemmas and survival challenges such as this, and then in our own species that we can present ourselves with a survival challenge like this? How is that kind of transformation even possible? Ed White's spacewalk, the first human to take a walk in space. How is it if, in fact, evolutionary process tethered our species through change over time, tethered our species to and human possibilities and mentality and society to a particular ancestral habitat and to particular conditions of life? How could that transformation have taken place? Another pairing of slides that I think captures this is, can be expressed in this way. The oldest known stone tool tradition, the old one dating back to about 2.6 million years ago. And the question that's posed here is, how is it that our evolutionary journey and technology go from something like this to something like this? And as you can read there, this is space debris that is encircling the Earth. As I write there, the entire planet has become an archaeological site. And so in many different ways, our species resides on a human-altered planet. Well, in seeking to understand transformations such as this, we run right up against the fundamental scientific challenge of seeing ourselves as a phenomenon of nature. And I think that, sadly, the folk ways in which we see our species often sees and assigns Homo sapiens almost as an aberration, of nature. And the dichotomies, the traditional dichotomies, line up in a series of false oppositions: human versus nature, cultural versus natural, learning versus instinct, even human versus animal. And it's especially that latter dichotomy that highlights the false division that occurs in this particular perspective. Now, human evolution is the period that we have been looking at so far in these first several talks, namely the past 6 or 7 million years of Earth's history, where the baseline adaptations and the initial possibilities of our species emerged in ancestors who are no longer around. And so one way to pursue the question of how the accumulation of adaptations occurred over time is to examine the environmental context of that entire time period. And so data like this, which have been shown in the previous 2 talks and are also is shown on the front of your programs, is the oxygen isotope curve showing changes and the trends and fluctuation in ocean temperature and global ice volume. It's an iconic diagram of paleoclimatology, and it shows that the past 6 million years, corresponding with the period of human evolutionary history, have been one of the most dramatic periods of climate oscillation of the Cenozoic era of the past 65 million years. As Peter Domenical showed in his talk, paleoclimate records express at least 2 signals: the overall trend as well as the variability. And up to about, I would say, 20 years ago, nearly every student in the study of human evolution considered the variability as simply noise in the all-important trend toward a cooler and drier Earth. It was the direction of change, the onset of grassland-dominated savannas and in East Africa or in Africa in general, and of ice age conditions in higher latitudes, that was thought to be the signal that elicited the emergence of uniquely human adaptations. Yet all of the environmental records also show periods of strong instability, of amplitude variations as there were switches between arid and moist, and between cool and warm. Now, among many factors that have an influence on Earth's climate system, Earth's orbital dynamics certainly are one of them, as expressed in this figure. We live on a spinning planet whose axis of rotation is tilted, and therefore there are variations, fluctuations, in the amount of solar radiation that hits the Earth at different times of the year and different places on Earth. And so we see these 3 variables represented here of eccentricity, the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun. The tilt of the Earth's axis also varies. Eccentricity, the shape of the Earth's orbit, the first factor, goes from a more circular orbit to a more oval or elliptical orbit. The tilt of the Earth's axis of rotation varies, and also there is this wobble in the Earth's axis of rotation that relates to precession. Well, when you look at African climate, and really climate all over the globe, but African climate is strongly influenced by variation in solar insolation, and looking at two of those variables. It's the interaction of orbital precession, which have cycles of 19,000 and 23,000 years approximately, and eccentricity, the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun, which has periodicities of about 100,000 years and about 413,000 years. And you put those 4 wavy lines together, 4 basically sine curves together, and the interaction of them shows that there is this there are these alternating phases of high and low climate variability in tropical Africa. And Peter Domenical has been instrumental in helping me to understand this as we got together in a project a number of years ago. And so what we've been able to do, and this is going to come out in a publication soon, is that we've been able to label according to very specific intervals of changes between the high climate variability times and the low climate variability times, of labeling back through time, back over the last 5 million years we've been able to do this, the highs and the lows, the times of strong instability in East African climate, where the amplitude of dry and wet were exacerbated, were magnified, versus times of greater stability, the low periods. What we've been able to show is that the kinds of records that Peter has studied, for example, the dust records as well as the wet-dry cycles that are recorded in the Mediterranean relating to Eastern and Northeast African climate, support this alternation and this pattern of division between high and low climate variability. Well, this same paper, which will come out later this year, also explores, well, did the places in East Africa, where early humans lived, where we find fossils and stone tools, do those also see fluctuations of this sort? And it turns out in that all of the really prolonged periods of high climate variability, we see also amplification in landscape variability in East African sedimentary basins. So for example, this place with the almost unpronounceable name of Olorgesailie in southern Kenya, where I've been working for the last 30 years, we see that between 350,000 and 50,000 years ago, which was the high, the prolonged high labeled H2 in the previous diagram, that time period, that we see the landscape changing in amazing ways of downcutting of the basin and then the basin filling up with sediments compared with earlier in time. And so we think that these are under climate control, these vast changes in landscape. And we see this for all of the other prolonged high variability intervals. I wondered whether in these prolonged high variability intervals, what happened? Was there anything interesting that happened in human evolutionary history? And you can see the time scale of 5 million years on the left. And what I've recorded here are the 8, that is the 25% longest periods of high climate variability, and the numbers that we've assigned them in this paper to come out. And we thought, okay, well, what goes on here? What can we tell from the fossil and archaeological record? And it turns out that almost everything that's interesting in African human evolution is concentrated in those periods of high climate variability. FAD, it's a strange word, but it just means first appearance datum, where a fossil or an archaeological piece of evidence shows us the beginning of a particular lineage in our evolutionary tree or behavior. And so for Australopithecus, of all of the major genera in our evolutionary tree, Australopithecus and Homo and Paranthropus are concentrated in a period of predicted high climate variability, also that of Homo sapiens at the top of the chart there. And also the origin of every single major technological and behavioral transition in human evolutionary history is focused in one of these prolonged high climate variability intervals. Now, one thing that could be easily criticized about this is that, yeah, but new fossils are found all the time and there are going to be new finds that are made. Well, that happened about a month and a half ago with a fossil jaw from Ethiopia that repositioned the origin of the genus Homo. Well, it turns out that it repositioned it in the next earliest, in the oldest period of high climate variability. Now, I'm not saying that this is proof, but it's nice to see a robust predictive model about this relationship of African human evolutionary history and these periods of high climate variability. We'll see what happens next with the new discoveries. And so we've also seen in our evolutionary tree that we used to have the march of hominids, going from ape-like to human-like. And that gave a sense of inevitability about the existence of our species on Earth. Well, that idea has been completely discarded. And we see that we are part of a much more diverse evolutionary tree. And in the context of environmental dynamics, as the conditions of life change with the shifts in landscape and in food and water and shelter, it makes sense that new behavioral possibilities, new adaptations and ways of life were at a premium if they could allow a greater degree of adjustment in these time periods of very strong variability in the environment. But this also means, since we're the last biped standing, that other ways of life, prior means of existence, could not be sustained, and they were lost. In the light of environmental dynamics, we can also inspect this overview of the adaptive history related to the origin, eventually, of Homo sapiens. And we can now see these adaptations as the evolution of behavioral flexibility and the development of a wider range of adaptive options and being able to switch strategies, essentially adaptability in the face of an unstable world. I don't have time to go through all of these points, certainly, but we can point out a few of them. So, for example, things like simple stone flaking and carrying of food and stones across the landscape associated with the genus Homo were ways of being able to buffer the changing menu of food distribution and food abundance over time during a high variability interval. The most rapid rate of increase in brain size relative to body size. Well, the brain is our organ of plasticity, one of our organs of plasticity, and that also becomes more understandable not as something that evolved in a specific narrow set of environmental and survival conditions, but in relationship to changing circumstances. Increased cultural diversity and technological innovation. That, of course, is a characteristic of our own species and has multiplied the options, the behavioral options within our own species. We also see in this chart the foundations for a human-altered planet. And for example, the changes in technology, control of fire and building of shelters, even things like the complex moving of resources across the landscape, we can see in the archaeological record, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And so what we see is that we have become very good at surviving by modifying our surroundings, and that humans, as a result, have spread worldwide. And so thus we have global change, global transformation of landscapes and the consumption of resources, even founded in this early evolutionary history of human beings. Now, my research team has been working toward the top of this time period, about 300,000 years ago, and very quickly. These are some of the things that were occurring in that period, going back to 280,000 years ago. And remember, that's a time period in Africa of prolonged high climate variability. And we see the beginning of innovations. We see increasing innovation, wider social networks, trade, the beginning of awareness of groups that are distant, far away, that you cannot see, and yet you're able to have a sense of values, of valuable rock, like obsidian rock that was traded over long distance. Complex symbolic activity, complex thinking and planning. And I would see this overall as, in an environmental context that we examine now in Africa, a greater capacity to adjust to new environments. I'm not going to show you any more than that, other than to say that our research team is about to extend some of these traits even further back in time, prior to 300,000 years ago. And so what we then come up with is that the new theme and story, the new theme and hallmark of our evolutionary story is one of adaptability, increasing adaptability, to endure change in the environment, to thrive in novel environments, to spread to new habitats, to respond in new ways to the surroundings. And these are characteristics of the genus Homo, and especially embodied in us, Homo sapiens. Final thoughts: the long-term view of human evolutionary history, the idea of the inevitability of our species has been discarded. It's been, I think, increasingly replaced by an emphasis on adaptability when human evolution is framed within the study of paleo-environments. And finally, adaptability, according to the definitions that I just gave, and the demise of ways of life have been two sides of the evolutionary process. And I think the question ahead for us is that this is evolutionary history, but in the cultural history that is now unfolding, will that still be the case? Thank you very much.